Henry Stone's life was a monument to his own success, a life built upon layers of power, wealth, and a relentless sense of superiority. As a self-made billionaire, Henry had crafted his existence with meticulous precision, and every aspect of it reflected the same calculated control he had employed in the boardrooms where he dominated. His empire, a sprawling network of companies, properties, and investments, was his kingdom, and he ruled over it with an iron fist. He lived in a world where money, influence, and status insulated him from the common struggles of those outside his circle. The struggles of ordinary people were, to him, simply inconveniences, something he never had to face. His wealth allowed him to bypass almost any obstacle in his path, whether it was through private jets that whisked him away from one luxury destination to another, or the expensive dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants where the world's elite gathered to indulge in opulence. Henry's every desire was catered to, and those around him, employees, acquaintances, even his family, were expected to maintain their place in the hierarchy he had created. To Henry, the world was a well-ordered machine, with everyone in their designated role, and he was the one pulling the strings. With wealth came entitlement, and Henry's sense of superiority was not only palpable but almost suffocating. His demeanor radiated an air of arrogance, a belief that he was always in control and that anyone beneath him existed only to serve his needs. His arrogance wasn't born of insecurity, rather, it was the product of his years of dominance in business. He had built his empire from the ground up, using whatever means necessary: intellect, ruthlessness, and an unflinching belief in his own abilities. Failure, for Henry, wasn't just an option, it was a foreign concept. Every venture he touched turned to gold, and his confidence in his ability to manipulate any situation made him untouchable. But this air of invincibility came at a price. His relationships were shallow, and his emotional connections non-existent. He didn't care for the people who worked for him, nor did he feel any empathy for those who served him in his personal life. To Henry, they were tools, nothing more. He didn't understand the struggles of the average person. Why would he? He had never had to work for anything in the way they had. To him, the world existed to be bent to his will, and those who didn't understand that were simply beneath him. It was on one of his frequent business trips to Europe that Henry's world of wealth and arrogance collided with something completely foreign, something he hadn't anticipated. Henry had arrived in Germany for a high-profile business event, a dinner with some of the country's wealthiest entrepreneurs and investors. The event was held in a luxurious restaurant, one known for its exclusivity and fine dining. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of high-priced wine and gourmet dishes. Henry was used to this environment, the polished wait staff, the impeccable service. He didn't even look up when he entered the restaurant. He knew that his presence alone would command the attention of everyone there. As he settled into his seat at the private table, a young waitress named Amara approached with a smile. She was poised, professional, and, to Henry, entirely forgettable, just another face in the sea of staff who existed to serve his every whim. Amara's uniform was pristine, her movements efficient. She handed him the wine list, her voice polite but distant. There was nothing remarkable about her, or so Henry thought. Over the course of the evening, as the guests around him conversed in various languages, Henry allowed himself to sink deeper into his sense of superiority. The other patrons at the table were all speaking in German, but Henry had been to Germany enough times to know the basics. He understood enough to get by, enough to dismiss anyone who might be beneath him. The air of exclusivity had become almost too familiar, and Henry grew increasingly annoyed by the fact that the dinner was dragging on longer than he had anticipated. He wanted to get back to business, to the things that really mattered. As Amara passed by once more, Henry's impatience got the best of him. He turned to the guest sitting next to him and muttered a few words in German, unaware that Amara was still nearby. "Isn't it funny," Henry said, with a sneer on his face, "how they always put the least intelligent people in these positions? I mean, it's all the same with these waiters, just smile and nod. It's like they're too dumb to do anything else. She probably doesn't even know what she's serving." The words came easily to Henry, laced with his usual arrogance. He expected no reaction, no consequence, because why should he? He was above all of this. He glanced back toward Amara, who was quietly arranging the next course on the table, but he didn't think for a second that she might have heard him. What Henry didn't know, however, was that Amara was fluent in German. She had grown up speaking the language, one of the many she had mastered in her pursuit of education and self-improvement. Amara had spent years honing her language skills, not just because she loved learning, but because it opened doors to opportunities that might otherwise have been closed to her. She had worked hard to be where she was, to get the job that allowed her to earn a living. And yet, despite all her accomplishments, there were people like Henry who never saw her for the intelligent, capable person she truly was. A few moments passed before Amara returned to the table, this time with a tray of food. Henry was still oblivious, lost in his own sense of superiority. As he reached for his wine glass, he couldn't help but feel that, for once, something had shifted in the atmosphere. When Amara approached him, she smiled politely, just as she had before. But this time, as she placed the dish in front of him, she looked him directly in the eye, and in perfect, unaccented German, she said, "Is there something you'd like to add to your order, sir, or would you like to discuss the quality of the wine a little further?" The words cut through the air like a sharp blade, and Henry's face immediately drained of color. He froze, his arrogance slipping away in an instant. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as Henry realized the depth of his mistake. He had assumed she couldn't understand him. He had assumed she was just another lowly servant, someone beneath his notice. But Amara's response, calm, composed, and delivered without a hint of malice, shattered his perception of the world. The stares of those around him burned like fire, and Henry, normally so confident and self-assured, felt a flush of embarrassment rise in his chest. His own words had come back to haunt him, and for the first time in a long time, he was the one who was exposed, vulnerable in his own arrogance. Amara simply nodded and turned to leave, her composure never faltering. She had made her point, one that Henry couldn't ignore. The world he had constructed, a world of wealth, control, and disdain for anyone below him, had been shaken by the quiet strength of someone he had never bothered to truly see. Henry was left speechless, the arrogance that once defined him now hollow and insignificant in the wake of Amara's calm and unexpected response. Henry had always prided himself on being perceptive, on being able to read people, to understand the intricacies of a situation and adjust his approach accordingly. As a successful businessman with a reputation for sharp instincts, he assumed that he could size up anyone, no matter their background. When Amara first approached his table, he quickly filed her away as just a waitress, a cog in the larger machine of the restaurant, there to serve him and nothing more. He hadn't thought twice about it, dismissing her with a glance. But as their conversation unfolded, his carefully constructed assumptions began to crumble. When she responded to him, speaking in perfect, fluent French, Henry's mind briefly stalled. The words she had spoken, so smooth and unruffled, caught him completely off guard. For a moment, he felt a flash of disbelief. How could she, someone so obviously working in a service position, know a language that required such depth of knowledge? He had assumed, with an arrogance that now seemed almost embarrassing, that someone like her couldn't possibly have the education or the capacity for such a sophisticated skill. And yet, here she was, speaking French effortlessly, as if she were his equal in intellect, in ability, in dignity. Henry quickly shook himself from his surprise, trying to regain his composure. He told himself that it was just a fluke, perhaps a coincidence, maybe something she had learned on the side, but as the evening wore on, that initial discomfort began to settle deeper into his chest. It gnawed at him, the realization that Amara had just challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. She had done it without anger, without confrontation, just with a simple, composed response. And it had shaken him to his core. He couldn't help but watch her as she went about her work, moving fluidly between tables, attending to customers with a quiet professionalism that only heightened his awareness. She wasn't rattled by his reaction. She wasn't seeking validation, or even making any attempt to draw attention to herself. She simply returned to her duties, as though the exchange had never happened. This was a stark contrast to Henry's usual expectations of those who worked in service. In his experience, most people in such positions were eager for approval, subservient, almost desperately trying to please. But Amara was different. She wasn't intimidated by him. She didn't apologize for existing in his world. Instead, she carried herself with quiet confidence that, for the first time in a long while, made Henry feel uneasy. As dinner continued, Henry's mind raced, grappling with his own feelings of irritation, mixed with something that was far more disconcerting: respect. Despite himself, he admired her calm demeanor. There was a poise in her movements, a self-assurance in the way she interacted with him that challenged the way he had always viewed the world. He had assumed, without even thinking about it, that people like Amara were lesser, that their roles defined them completely. And yet, she had demonstrated that she was so much more than he had ever imagined. The dinner went on in an odd, tense quiet. He ate, he drank, but his mind kept returning to her. She had made him question his worldview, not just about her, but about his interactions with others in general. In the past, he had been so quick to dismiss people, to categorize them based on where they worked, what they wore, how they spoke. But Amara had slipped through the cracks of those assumptions, leaving him with a nagging sense of guilt that he was entirely unprepared for. He had never been the type of person to apologize for his behavior. In fact, he often thought of himself as someone who operated by a higher standard, someone who was entitled to his opinions and beliefs. He believed that his success, his status, validated his worldview. But now, in the quiet hum of the restaurant, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the table, he found himself wrestling with something unfamiliar: guilt. Guilt for the way he had assumed she was just another cog in the system. Guilt for the way he had spoken to her, perhaps with a condescension he hadn't even realized he had been carrying. Guilt for the underlying arrogance that colored his interactions with people in service. He had never thought much about the lives of the people around him, those who weren't in his social circles or who didn't operate within the same world of influence and power that he did. They were, in his eyes, there to serve. But now, with Amara standing in front of him, poised and composed, something had shifted inside him. His assumption of superiority had been cracked wide open, and he found himself looking at the world and at her with new eyes. The rest of the meal passed in a haze. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was now seeing everything through a different lens. It was almost as though Amara's presence had punctured the armor of certainty he had so carefully constructed over the years. For the first time, he felt vulnerable, and it was a feeling he was wholly unaccustomed to. Amara continued to serve him, without any hint of discomfort or deference, and Henry could only watch in a kind of stunned silence. As the evening wore on, the realization settled deeper in his bones: his assumptions were wrong. He had looked at her, and others like her, and seen nothing but the roles they played in society: waitstaff, servers, employees. He had reduced them to their functions, never imagining that they, too, could be full of knowledge, skill, and depth. And now, for the first time, he was forced to reckon with that truth. It was a jarring, uncomfortable feeling, but it was also an awakening. The world wasn't as simple as he had thought. People weren't just defined by the titles they held or the positions they occupied. There was complexity beneath the surface, and it was something he had completely overlooked. Amara's quiet grace had done something Henry couldn't quite name. It had shattered the illusion he had lived with for so long, the belief that those in service were beneath him. She had proven him wrong in the most subtle way, and he felt it deeply. There was something about her that made him question everything he thought he knew. As Henry left the restaurant that night, the image of Amara lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just encountered someone who, despite the world's judgments, was far more than what she appeared to be. And for the first time in a long time, Henry found himself questioning the narrow view of the world he had always held, uncertain of how he could go back to seeing things the same way again. The incident with Amara continued to gnaw at Henry in the days that followed. At first, he tried to brush it off, telling himself that it was just a momentary lapse, a brief interaction that would fade from his mind as quickly as it had appeared. But as the hours passed, Amara's words lingered, echoing in his thoughts when he least expected it. Her calm, unwavering demeanor in the face of his arrogance had rattled him in a way he couldn't quite shake off. He had always prided himself on being able to manipulate situations, to bend people to his will with a glance, a carefully timed word, or a commanding tone. In the past, his self-assurance had been an asset, an unshakable belief in his own superiority that had propelled him forward in both his career and personal life. But now, there was a seed of doubt, planted by Amara's simple yet powerful response. Her ability to stand her ground in the face of his dismissiveness had forced him to question his approach to the world. Why had he assumed he could treat people as tools for his own success? Why had he felt so entitled to their respect, their service, without ever offering them the same courtesy in return? The more Henry tried to dismiss these thoughts, the more they resurfaced, creeping into his mind at the most inconvenient times. As he went through his daily routine, he began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. He caught himself glaring at a barista who fumbled his coffee order, snapping at a colleague for asking an innocent question. These small moments, these tiny lapses in courtesy, began to accumulate, and Henry found himself becoming more and more uncomfortable in his own skin. He couldn't ignore the fact that his usual arrogance had begun to backfire. The first real consequence came when he lost a major business deal. He had been negotiating with a potential client for weeks, carefully positioning himself to secure a lucrative contract that would significantly boost his company's profile. As the final meeting approached, Henry felt confident that the deal was all but sealed. However, when they sat down to discuss terms, his usual arrogance seeped through. He was dismissive of the client's concerns, brushing them off with a wave of his hand, certain that he knew better than anyone else in the room. He spoke over the client, interrupting with his own agenda, all the while expecting them to bow to his superior knowledge. It wasn't until the meeting ended abruptly, with the client walking out in frustration, that Henry realized what had just happened. He had pushed too hard, assumed too much, and in doing so, he had alienated the very person he had been trying to impress. The deal was lost just like that. The feeling of disbelief washed over him as he sat there, staring at the empty conference table, the remnants of his arrogance hanging in the air like a bad smell. For the first time in a long while, Henry was forced to confront the reality of his behavior. His approach to business had always worked in the past, but now, it felt wrong. His arrogance, once a shield that had protected him from the world, now seemed to be a liability, a self-imposed barrier that kept him from connecting with people on a deeper level. He had relied on his ability to dominate every situation, to control every interaction, but now he was beginning to see how damaging that mentality had been, not just to his career, but to his relationships as well. The effects of his actions rippled outward. At home, his relationship with his wife, Rachel, had become increasingly strained. She had always supported him, but lately, she had begun to pull away, her patience wearing thin. Henry's arrogance had seeped into their marriage, and it showed. He snapped at her when she made suggestions, belittled her opinions when they didn't align with his own. The once easy, affectionate connection they had shared felt distant now, as if they were two strangers living under the same roof. Rachel confronted him one evening after dinner. "Henry," she said quietly, her voice tinged with frustration, "what's going on with you? You're not the man I married. You're different, and I don't like it." Her words stung more than he expected, and he didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to defend himself, to justify his behavior, but deep down, he knew she was right. He had been pushing her away, just as he had pushed everyone else. His need to maintain control, to assert his dominance, had blinded him to the people who mattered most. He had been so wrapped up in his own sense of superiority that he hadn't stopped to consider how his actions were affecting the ones who cared about him. That night, after Rachel went to bed, Henry sat in the living room, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. The reality of his situation was undeniable. His arrogance had cost him the business deal, had strained his relationship with his wife, and was starting to alienate the people around him. And all of it was tied back to the way he had treated others, particularly those in positions of service, who were always beneath him in his mind. Amara's face flashed in his mind, her calm, measured words ringing in his ears. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" she had said, not with anger, but with quiet certainty. The sting of her words came back to him with a force that made him uncomfortable. In a way, she had held up a mirror to his own soul, showing him a version of himself that he had never wanted to see. The internal conflict grew stronger with each passing day. Henry knew that his old ways were no longer effective, but he didn't know how to change. How could he let go of the control he had held onto for so long? How could he move beyond the arrogance that had defined him for so many years? And more importantly, was it even possible to change, or had he already gone too far down this path? At work, the consequences of his behavior were beginning to catch up with him. His employees had started to notice the shift in his attitude, and it was affecting their morale. His usual confidence had turned into a harshness that made it difficult for anyone to approach him. Meetings that once flowed smoothly now felt like battlefields, where Henry's sharp tongue and critical nature alienated even his most loyal staff. But despite the mounting pressure, there was a part of him, small but persistent, that wanted to change. The realization that his actions were damaging the things he valued most, the relationships, the respect, the success, was slowly sinking in. He knew he couldn't keep going down this path. Yet, the more he tried to fight against his ingrained habits, the more difficult it became. As the stakes rose, Henry found himself at a crossroads. He could either double down on his old ways, continuing to exert control over every aspect of his life, or he could confront the truth and begin the difficult process of self-awareness and growth. The fear of losing control was immense, but the fear of losing everything else, the respect of others, the love of his wife, his sense of purpose, was even greater. The struggle within him intensified as he wrestled with the uncomfortable truth that his actions were not only harming those around him, but were also slowly chipping away at his own sense of integrity. And while he knew change was necessary, he was still unsure of how to make it happen. Henry sat in the familiar restaurant, his eyes scanning the bustling room. The dim lighting and the soft murmur of conversation felt almost like a comfort, a place where he had come to assert control over his environment. He had come back here, hoping to regain the sense of order he once had in his life. The usual ritual was simple: arrive, take his seat, and wait for the food, all while maintaining his air of superiority over those around him. The predictability of the situation had always been part of his charm. It was easy, effortless even, to be the powerful man who expected the world to cater to him. He ordered his meal, the same one he had requested on his previous visit, anticipating the familiar face of the server who had caught his attention before Amara. But when the server approached, it wasn't Amara. Instead, a young man with a disinterested expression placed the menu down in front of him. Henry raised an eyebrow, immediately irritated. "Where is she?" he asked, though his tone was almost too casual, masking the sharpness of his impatience. The server gave a brief shrug. "I think she's off today." Henry's disappointment was swift, though he tried to mask it. He didn't know why he had expected to see her again. She was just a server, after all, someone who should never have been able to capture his attention. Still, there was something about Amara, something about the way she carried herself, that had lingered in his mind long after their brief encounter. He tried to focus on his meal, but as he sat there, the emptiness of the experience grew more pronounced. The room was the same, busy, filled with people chatting and laughing. The food smelled just as good as it always did, but none of it seemed to matter. The comfortable predictability he so often relied on felt hollow. Henry's thoughts drifted back to Amara, recalling the way she had moved with such grace and professionalism, the sharpness of her wit, the quiet confidence that oozed from her without her ever having to say much. For the first time in a long while, he had felt vulnerable in her presence, something he had never allowed himself to experience. She had gotten under his skin, and it frustrated him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was something about her that made him question everything he had taken for granted. As he sat there, the minutes stretching out into what felt like hours, he realized how disconnected he had become from the reality of his life. In the past, he would have seen the absence of Amara as an opportunity to reaffirm his place at the top of the hierarchy, to enjoy his meal in peace and quiet. But now, it seemed to deepen his sense of emptiness. He was restless, anxious even. He had spent so many years cultivating his identity around his wealth, his status, and his ability to command respect through those means. But in this moment, that power felt shallow. Just as he was preparing to pay the bill and leave, his eyes flicked toward the entrance. And there she was, Amara, stepping into the room with a quiet confidence that immediately caught his attention. But this time, she wasn't walking around with a tray of drinks. She wasn't just another server. She was dressed in a sharp blazer, her posture more commanding than he had ever seen it. Amara had been promoted to manager. The revelation hit Henry harder than he expected. He sat back in his chair, the realization slowly sinking in. Amara wasn't just another woman who had caught his eye. She had worked hard to get where she was. Her promotion wasn't a fluke, it wasn't just about her looks or charm. It was about her skill, her intelligence, and her unshakable professionalism. She had earned her place, and Henry couldn't deny the fact that he now saw her in a completely different light. For the first time, Henry didn't see Amara as someone beneath him, someone to be admired or critiqued from a distance. He saw her as a peer, someone who had accomplished something through her own efforts, someone who had value beyond the surface. His initial reaction was almost a jolt of discomfort. How could this woman, who had once been nothing more than a server in his eyes, now stand as an equal in this space? The shift in power dynamics was so stark, so jarring, that he couldn't help but re-evaluate his previous thoughts about her. Amara didn't seem to notice Henry as she moved through the room, her presence calm and assured. It was clear that she was respected now, not just by the other staff, but by the customers as well. Henry's initial sense of superiority, his belief that wealth and status were the only things that determined a person's worth, began to unravel in that moment. He had spent so much of his life building his identity around the notion that money and power defined success. But here was Amara, someone who had risen through the ranks not because of wealth, but because of her hard work, determination, and skill. The realization struck Henry deeply, more deeply than he could have anticipated. In that moment, he saw the flaw in his previous beliefs. His worldview, which had been so firmly rooted in the idea that money and influence were the ultimate sources of respect, suddenly seemed naive. He began to see Amara not just as someone who had challenged his arrogance, but as someone who had earned his respect on her own terms. Amara's promotion was not just a shift in her career, it was a turning point for Henry. He understood now that true respect, true success, wasn't something that could be bought or inherited. It wasn't about who you knew or how much money you had in the bank. True respect came from how you treated others, how you carried yourself, and how you worked to better yourself and those around you. It was about the value you contributed to the world, not the power you wielded over it. As Henry sat there, he found himself questioning everything he had believed to be true. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his identity began to crumble, piece by piece. He was no longer the man who could command respect simply by walking into a room. He was now the man who had to earn respect, just like everyone else. And for the first time in his life, he realized that this was a far more meaningful way to live. Amara's quiet confidence and hard-earned success had shown him something he had never truly understood before, that the things that truly matter in life cannot be bought or controlled. They must be earned through actions, integrity, and dedication. In that moment, Henry understood that real power didn't come from wealth or status, it came from the ability to respect others, to see their value, and to acknowledge their hard work. As he left the restaurant that evening, Henry couldn't shake the profound shift he had experienced. He wasn't sure where this new understanding would take him, but he knew it would change him forever. This was the moment when his journey toward personal growth truly began, a journey that would require him to let go of old beliefs and open himself to the possibility of seeing the world and the people around him in a completely new light. Henry sat alone in his office, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The echoes of his recent conversation with Amara still reverberated in his mind. He had never been one to question himself, but now, as he replayed their encounter over and over, doubt gnawed at him. The sharp words he'd spoken, the arrogance with which he had dismissed her concerns, he could still feel the sting of his actions. Amara's face lingered in his thoughts, her hurt expression, the quiet but firm way she had rejected his defense of his behavior. She hadn't raised her voice, but there had been a finality in her tone that left him unsettled. She had seen through the facade Henry had spent years building around himself, the walls of pride and defensiveness that he had carefully crafted to protect himself from vulnerability. He had always believed he was above the rules, that his success gave him the right to act as he pleased. But Amara's refusal to let him off the hook had cracked something inside him, and now, he couldn't ignore the guilt that weighed heavily on his chest. His interactions with people, both professionally and personally, had been tainted by that same arrogance. Henry had always prided himself on being a sharp businessman, a man who could manipulate situations to his advantage. He had played people, used them, and discarded them when they no longer served his purpose. But as he sat there, the realization hit him like a cold wave: he had hurt so many people along the way. Colleagues who had tried to warn him, friends who had distanced themselves after repeated betrayals, and even strangers who had been caught in the crossfire of his ambition. It wasn't just Amara. It was everyone. Henry had been a tornado, sweeping through lives without consideration of the damage he left behind. And now, in the quiet aftermath, he felt the full weight of his actions. The next day, as he walked through the office, Henry noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. His colleagues no longer greeted him with the same familiarity they once had. There were fewer smiles, fewer attempts at casual conversation. People spoke in hushed tones when they thought he wasn't listening, and the tension in the air was palpable. He had always been the dominant force in the office, the one who commanded attention with a few well-chosen words. But now, he felt like a shadow of the person he once was. At first, he tried to brush it off, attributing it to a temporary dip in his mood or the natural ebb and flow of office dynamics. But as the days wore on, the discomfort grew harder to ignore. His employees no longer respected him the way they had before. He overheard snippets of conversation that were pointed and critical, the whispers of doubt and mistrust that followed him through every hallway. They noticed his change, or rather, his lack of change. They could see that he was struggling with something, but they didn't know what it was. And worst of all, they didn't trust that he could ever truly change. Henry's efforts to make amends were clumsy at best. He tried to reach out to people he had wronged, starting with those closest to him. He called his old mentor, someone he had once looked up to but had grown distant from over the years. His mentor's voice was cool on the other end of the line, skeptical of Henry's newfound humility. "I'm not sure what you expect, Henry," his mentor had said. "You've burned a lot of bridges. People don't forget that easily." Henry felt a sting, but he deserved it. He had built his life on a foundation of ego, and now he was trying to rebuild from the wreckage. But the truth was, he wasn't sure how to do that. How could he make up for the years of selfishness, of putting himself above everyone else? He didn't have the answers, and his attempts to seek them out only felt hollow and forced. His apologies seemed awkward, incomplete, as if they were missing something essential. Later, he sat across from his assistant, Jennifer, who had been one of the few people to stand by him throughout the years. She was the type of person who always seemed to know the right thing to say, the person who had tolerated his outbursts and offered a calm presence when he needed it. He had wronged her more times than he cared to admit, and now he found himself struggling to make amends. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice low. "I've been difficult. I've taken you for granted." Jennifer looked at him with a mixture of pity and wariness. "It's a little late for apologies, don't you think?" Her words stung more than he anticipated, but he couldn't deny their truth. He had taken her and so many others for granted. Now, the damage was done, and no amount of apology could undo it. People didn't forget the times he had belittled them, or the moments when his arrogance had crushed their attempts at speaking up. They didn't forget the way he had made them feel small, the way he had made them question their own worth in order to fuel his own sense of superiority. Henry was no longer comfortable with the person he had been. He had been arrogant, dismissive, and ruthless. And now, he found himself trapped in the aftermath of his actions, unable to undo the hurt he had caused. The people he had once seen as mere tools or stepping stones had their own lives, their own feelings, and now they were pushing him away. They didn't owe him forgiveness, and they didn't owe him anything. Yet, in the midst of his despair, he couldn't help but cling to a shred of hope, the hope that he could change, that he could make things right, even if it was too late. But change was harder than he had ever imagined. The gap between the person he had been and the person he wanted to become felt insurmountable. Henry had gained awareness of his faults, but awareness wasn't enough to heal the wounds he had inflicted. There were no quick fixes, no shortcuts to redemption. The road ahead was uncertain, and he didn't know if he could ever fully repair the damage he had done. For now, all he could do was sit with the weight of his guilt and try to move forward, even if the path ahead felt impossibly steep. He had taken the first step by acknowledging his shortcomings, but the real challenge lay in the next steps, the long, painful process of proving that he was capable of change. And that, he realized, was the true test. Henry's transformation was not something that had happened overnight. It was a slow and painful process, a shift that challenged every foundational belief he had built his life upon. For years, he had been the embodiment of success, at least, by conventional standards. He had climbed the corporate ladder with relentless determination, never questioning his methods or the cost of his ambition. He had gained wealth, power, and influence, all of which had insulated him from the kinds of doubts and vulnerabilities that others might experience. But now, as he stepped into a new chapter of his life, Henry found himself facing an unfamiliar adversary, his own ego. As he sought to change, Henry encountered pushback from the very people who had once been his allies. His business associates, men who had long admired his aggressive drive and unapologetic pursuit of success, were the first to voice their concerns. They were skeptical of the changes he was trying to implement. Henry's newfound humility, his desire